Chapter 8. A Crack in the Sky. He was going to have to go tonight, while it was dark. Otherwise, Hoyt would see him and try to shoot him again. This gave Grover a queasy feeling in his stomach, which made it hard to eat his dinner. When dinner was over and the little kids were in bed, his parents settled on the couch and flicked on the TV. A government spokesman was talking about the deadline the president had set for the phalanx nations to agree to the United States demands, and that if the demands weren't met, the consequences would be serious. But no one should be alarmed, because emergency measures were planned, and... "I'm going outside for a while," Grover said. "All right," his mother said without looking at him. "Be back in by 9:30. Grover went out the back door as if he were going across the yard to his shed, but instead he circled around the side of the house and headed down the street. Lucky it wasn't raining, he thought. Rain would turn his blue notebook into a soggy rag, and lucky the moon was just a sliver in the sky, shedding hardly any light. That would help him hide from Hoyt's sharp eyes. Grover hurried downhill. He wanted to get this over with. If he hadn't already filled in so much of the application form, he could just leave it there and send for another one. But he'd put in hours trying to get it just right. And besides, the deadline was only a week away. He wouldn't have time to send for another one, get it done, and turn it in on time. He had to find the one he'd lost. He passed the last house on his street and turned left onto Raven Road. It was darker here, because there were fewer houses shining the light from their windows out into the night. In less than 5 minutes, he came to the drive that led back into Hoyt's land, and started walking up it. His shoes crunched on the gravel, a sound that seemed much too loud. He tried to walk on the edge of the drive, where the gravel merged into dirt, but his feet kept getting tangled in the brambles that grew there. He crept along to the left, moving toward the back of the house, staying as close to the fence as he could. The house loomed tall and dark. Only one window on the top story was lit. With thorns and stickers catching at his sleeves, Grover made his way through the thickets of brush to the place where, that afternoon, he'd frozen at the sound of Hoyt's voice. He was sure this was where he'd dropped his books. His notebook should be right there on the ground, as long as Hoyt hadn't found it and thrown it in the trash, or some animal hadn't taken it away to shred for its nest. There was a straight line of sight from here to the top window of the house, the one that now glowed yellow around the edges of the drawn shade. He dropped to his knees. Where was the darned thing? The shadows of the trees and bushes were so thick here he could hardly see at all. He'd have to find it by feel. He ran his hands over the ground. Pebbles, clumps of dirt, scratchy weeds, dry fallen leaves. But no notebook. He held back a groan of frustration. He had to find it, because if he didn't find it, he wouldn't be able to go. And even if he did get the money, and he had to go, because his whole future depended on it, and he was furious with himself for dropping it, and... At that moment, his fingers touched something smooth. He reached farther and felt the spiral wires. His notebook! He grabbed it and stood up. Carefully, he riffled the pages, feeling for the loose one. Yes, it was there, tucked into the middle, just where he'd put it. All right, now to get out of there. He turned back toward the driveway and felt his way forward between the tree trunks and the brush. He crept behind Hoyt's black car, parked near the corner of the house. At the spot where he'd have to go out into the open, he paused and checked the house again. It was still all dark, except for the wrangle of light around the top floor window. But as he watched, the light went out. Startled, Grover stepped back into the shadows and stood still for a moment. It might just be that Hoyt had turned off his light to sleep, or it might be that he'd heard something and was about to peer out his window. Grover waited and watched, and an odd thing happened. At first he thought he was imagining it. It was so faint. A light seemed to be growing behind the curtained and shuttered windows on the ground floor. It was a bluish light, like moonlight. It gleamed very faintly around the edges of the windows, in the gaps between the shades and the frames, until a narrow, pale bluish rectangle appeared all around the ground floor windows. What was it? Did Hoyt have 20 televisions that went on all at once? Was he doing some weird sort of experiment? Whatever it was, it gave Grover an eerie feeling. He stood still for a moment, staring. Then, as if his ears had suddenly been stuffed with cotton, the whole world seemed to go silent. And in the sky over Hoyt McCoy's house, a brilliant line, thin as a wire, shot across the darkness. It was there for less than a second. It vanished, and the sounds came back. Rustling leaves, a distant calling bird. But Grover had seen it. It wasn't his imagination. It had looked like a long, narrow crack, as if the two great round halves of the night sky had slid apart just for a second, just enough to let through a light that was on the other side. It was the strangest thing he had ever seen. But nothing else happened. The blue light continued to shine behind the windows. The house was silent. The sky stayed black. After another few minutes, Grover clutched his notebook tightly and moved toward the driveway, quiet as a cat and slow, until he got far enough from the house. Then he dashed along the driveway's edge down to Raven Road, where he set out for home.